My entire family knew my husband was cheating on me with my sister and helped him hide it. At my 35th birthday party, when I confronted them, they told me to be mature and just accept it, they're soulmates. My mother even said, "Don't be selfish. They're happy together." I just smiled and said, "You're right. I should be happy for them." I got up to leave and handed an envelope to my husband and my parents. Minutes later, he was screaming and begging me to come back as he stared at what was inside. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, pour yourself a cup of something warm, get comfortable, and just listen. My name is Meredith, and it's a difficult story, but it's mine, and I feel like it's time to finally let it out. It's funny how you can look back on your life and see it as a picture-perfect painting, only to realize later that the canvas was rotting from the inside out. For the longest time, I thought I had it all. I'm Meredith, and until about a year ago, when I was 35, my life was, by all accounts, perfect. I work as a senior software engineer for a pretty big tech firm. It's not glamorous, you know, I'm not a rock star or an artist. I'm the one people call when their network goes down or when they need a complex database untangled. I've always been the reliable one, the one who shows up, gets the job done, and takes care of everyone else. It's just who I am. I was married to Mitchell for 7 years. He was the kind of man who lit up a room. Handsome, outgoing, worked in sales. When we first met, I honestly thought he was way out of my league. We weren't perfect, of course, what couple is? But I loved him. I loved him with a completeness that felt like the very foundation of my world. I was working overtime, taking on side projects, saving every extra penny from my salary to build our dream home, a place where we could grow old together. And then there was my younger sister, Brenda. 30 years old and perpetually finding herself. She's always been the family favorite. The charming one, the creative one. While I was grinding through my computer science degree and climbing the corporate ladder, Brenda was flitting between passions. One month she was an aspiring painter, the next a wellness influencer with a failing Etsy store selling homemade candles. None of it ever stuck, but my parents, Gerald and Lorraine, they always defended her. She's artistic, my mother would say with a wave of her hand. Not everyone can be like Meredith. Despite it all, I loved my sister. When she needed help, I was there. I helped her set up a website for one of her ventures. When she needed a car and her credit was shot, I co-signed the loan. When she was short on rent, a few $100s would quietly move from my account to hers. That's what family does, right? You show up for each other. My parents raised us on that mantra. Family first, my dad always said. Blood is thicker than water. The irony of that stings now, like acid. Looking back, I was always the odd one out, the sturdy, boring foundation that everyone else built their more exciting lives upon. At family dinners, Brenda would hold court with stories of her latest misadventure, while I'd listen quietly. When I'd share news about a big project or a promotion at work, they'd nod politely, and the conversation would inevitably swing back to Brenda. You don't need as much attention, honey, Mom would say if I ever pointed it out. You're already successful. Mitchell and Brenda were always close. Too close, if I'm being honest now, but I trusted them. I trusted them both completely. They were constantly texting, sharing inside jokes I wasn't privy to. He'd always find an excuse to come over when I was at work, saying he was helping Brenda with something. But I never suspected a thing. Why would I? He was my husband. She was my sister. They were my whole world. The change was subtle at first, like the air shifting before a storm. About 8 months before everything blew up, Mitchell started to get distant. It wasn't one big thing, just 1,000 tiny, sharp little things. He started putting his phone face down on the nightstand, a simple act that felt like a slammed door in my face. When I'd walk into the room while he was on a call, he'd suddenly lower his voice to a whisper and say, "Hey, I gotta go." "Who was that?" I'd ask, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just Mark from the office," he'd reply, already turning away. But the excuses started to feel thin, worn out. The boys' nights started happening more often, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. He'd come home late, smelling of expensive cologne I didn't recognize and a faint trace of a perfume that definitely wasn't mine. When I'd ask, he'd just laugh it off. "You know how it is, honey, happy hour with clients." I wanted to believe him. I really did. So I'd just nod and hang up his jacket, my stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. Then Brenda started showing up more. Always with a reason, of course. She needed to borrow my professional-grade printer. She wanted to use our fast internet to upload a video. She had to drop something off for Mom. The timing was the thing that got under my skin. It was almost uncanny. If I had a business trip scheduled, she'd find a reason to be at our house within an hour of me leaving for the airport. Once, I came home a day early from a conference in Denver. I walked in, and the house felt different. There was a coffee mug in the sink that I didn't recognize. It was one of those quirky, handmade pottery mugs, Brenda's latest obsession. When I asked Mitchell about it, he shrugged. "Oh, she must have left it here last week when she came by." But I had run the dishwasher just before I left. The mug was new. The suspicion started to feel like a constant hum in the back of my mind, the kind of thoughts you push down because the alternative is just too horrible to consider. You tell yourself you're being paranoid, that you're just stressed from work. Because if you're not imagining it, what does that mean for your life? What does that mean for everything you've built? The little things kept piling up. Finding my hairbrush in a different spot on the vanity. The guest bedroom, which we never used, looking like someone had slept in it, the pillows slightly indented. Mitchell being oddly cold some days, treating me like a roommate he barely tolerated, only to become overly affectionate the next, as if he were overcompensating for something. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught in a fog of confusion and a deep, gnawing dread that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The breaking point came before a 3-day business trip to Chicago. The feeling in the house was unbearable. Mitchell was almost eager for me to leave, his goodbye kiss feeling more like relief than affection. As I drove to the airport, that cold knot in my stomach tightened until I could barely breathe. I was a logical person, an engineer. I dealt in data and proof. But this was a raw, primal instinct screaming at me that I was being played for a fool. On a complete impulse, I pulled off the highway and drove to a Best Buy. I walked through the automatic doors, my heart pounding in my ears. I felt ridiculous, like some character in a cheap soap opera. But I walked straight to the home security aisle and bought the smallest, most discreet camera I could find. It was a little black cube, easily hidden. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, for home security. I drove home, my hands shaking slightly as I unpacked it. I set it up on the bookshelf in the living room, tucked behind a row of encyclopedias, with a clear view of the front door and the kitchen. It connected to an app on my phone. As I finished, I took a deep breath and told myself, "You're being crazy. You'll probably never even check this." Then I grabbed my suitcase and left for my flight, the little black cube sitting silently on the shelf, an unblinking eye in the heart of my home. I was wrong. I was so wrong. The first day of the trip was a blur of meetings and presentations. I tried to focus, to push the nagging dread away, but it was always there. That night, Mitchell sent me a text. "The house feels so empty without you. Counting down the minutes till you're home. Miss you." I stared at the words, a wave of guilt washing over me. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was about to destroy my marriage over nothing. The next day, during a lunch break between quarterly projections, I couldn't take it anymore. My hand trembled as I opened the app on my phone. The live feed loaded, showing my quiet, empty living room. I felt a small bit of relief. Then, I tapped on the motion-activated recordings from the day before. The first clip was just me leaving. The second was the mailman. And then, the third. My world stopped. The timestamp was just 2 hours after he'd sent that text about missing me. The front door opened, and Brenda walked in. She didn't knock. She used a key. She dropped her purse on the counter, a proprietary air about her, and then Mitchell walked into the frame from the bedroom. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair messy like he'd just woken from a nap. And then I saw it. He wrapped his arms around her waist, and she turned and kissed him. It wasn't a friendly peck on the cheek. It was the kind of deep, passionate, hungry kiss that left no room for doubt. It was the kiss of lovers who thought they were safe, hidden away in the home I had worked so hard to build. He moved around our kitchen like he owned the place, while my sister, leaned against the counter, watching him with an adoring look I hadn't seen from her in years. I sat there, in that cold, sterile conference room, surrounded by the meaningless chatter of business, and I felt my entire life crumble into dust. 7 years of marriage. A lifetime of sisterhood. It was all a lie. The picture-perfect painting wasn't just rotting. It was a forgery. And I had been the fool admiring it on the wall the whole time. Something inside me broke that day. But it didn't shatter into a million pieces like I thought it would. It was more like a clean, cold snap. The part of me that loved and trusted, the naive part that always gave people the benefit of the doubt, it just died. And in its place, something new and hard and cold began to form. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I spent the rest of that business trip in a haze. I went to the meetings, I shook the hands, I smiled the smiles. But inside, my mind was racing, processing, calculating. Part of me, a small, pathetic part, hoped I had misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation. But the woman who had bought that camera, the engineer who relied on data, knew better. The data was clear. The conclusion was undeniable. When I got home, I played the part of the loving wife. I hugged Mitchell, asked about his week, and told him I missed him. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, to look into the eyes of the man I loved and see nothing but a stranger, a liar. While he slept that night, I was awake. I downloaded the footage from the camera's cloud storage, making multiple backups. I took screenshots of the timestamps, the damning evidence of their betrayal. The next few weeks were a surreal exercise in self-control. I became a detective in my own life. I started paying closer attention, and now that I knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere, screaming at me. The way they'd avoid eye contact with me when we were all in the same room. The sudden, cloying affection Mitchell would show me whenever Brenda was around, a sick performance for an audience of one. I started digging. I went through our shared phone bills, line by line. Hundreds of calls and texts between them, often late at night or during the day when I was at work. I looked at our credit card statements. Dinners at fancy restaurants I'd never been to. A hotel charge from a weekend he'd told me he was on a fishing trip with friends. It was all there, a meticulously documented history of their affair, paid for with our joint account. The pain was a physical thing. Some days it was a dull ache in my chest. Other days it was a sharp, stabbing agony that made it hard to breathe. I'd be in the middle of a meeting, designing a software patch, and the image of them kissing in my kitchen would flash in my mind, and I'd have to excuse myself to the restroom to keep from screaming. I channeled that pain. I let it fuel me. I met with a lawyer. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane who specialized in high-asset divorces. I laid everything out on her polished mahogany table, the videos, the phone records, the credit card statements. She listened without a word, her expression unreadable. When I was done, she simply pushed a box of tissues towards me and said, "Good. You've done the hard part. Now we do my part." She helped me get my finances in order. I quietly opened a new bank account in my name only and rerouted my salary there. I left just enough in our joint account to cover the mortgage and utilities, so he wouldn't suspect a thing. The deed to our house was solely in my name, a decision my father had insisted on when we bought it, saying a woman should always have a place that was hers alone. I had thought it was old-fashioned then. Now, I saw it as the lifeline it was. I had Diane draft the divorce papers. I signed them. I was no longer just a wife. I was a strategist. Every tear I shed in private. Every wave of rage that washed over me, I channeled into another organized folder of evidence, another call to my lawyer, another step in a plan that was becoming clearer by the day. They thought I was the naive, reliable, stable Meredith. They had no idea who I was becoming. The day of my 35th birthday arrived. Mitchell, with a breathtaking level of hypocrisy, had insisted on throwing me a party at our house. A small family gathering, he'd said. It was perfect. A stage of their own making for the final act I had written. They all arrived that evening, my whole family. My parents, Gerald and Lorraine, beaming and bearing gifts. And Brenda, who had the audacity to hug me and wish me a happy birthday, her cheek brushing against mine. The smell of her perfume was the same one I'd smelled on Mitchell's jacket. I just smiled. We went through the motions. Small talk, opening presents. I felt a strange, detached calm, like I was watching a movie of my own life. I knew this was the last time I would ever see them all together like this, as my family. Finally, after we'd finished the cake, I stood up. I have something I need to talk to everyone about, I said, my voice steady. The room went quiet. I looked at Mitchell. It's about you. And Brenda. I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, but it was my mother who spoke first. She held up a hand, a gesture meant to be gentle but felt like a blow. Meredith, honey, she said, her voice soft and condescending. We know. The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. I looked around. At my father, who was suddenly very interested in the pattern on his plate. At Brenda, who had moved to stand just behind Mitchell, her hand resting on his back. At Mitchell, whose panic had been replaced by a grim sort of resolution. No one looked ashamed. No one looked sorry. They looked prepared. You know? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. We've known for months, my dad said, still not meeting my eyes. We were hoping you'd figure it out on your own. This wasn't a confession. It was an intervention. And I was the one being intervened upon. We tried to fight it, Meredith, Brenda said, her voice filled with a sickeningly fake sincerity. But you can't fight true love. She said it without a trace of irony. True love. My mother stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. They're soulmates, honey, she said, as if explaining something to a simple-minded child. Mitchell makes her happy. Don't you want your sister to be happy? Don't be selfish, she added, when I didn't respond. They're happy together. My father nodded gravely. You need to be mature about this, Meredith. Sometimes these things just happen. They were all looking at me, waiting for me to break, to scream, to cry. They had their narrative all worked out. I was the cold, career-focused wife who had neglected her husband. Brenda was the free spirit who had captured his heart. And they were the loving family trying to manage the fallout. For a moment, I felt the rage, hot and blinding. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to burn it all to the ground. But then, that cold, hard thing that had formed inside me took over. A strange calm washed over me, and I found myself smiling. A real, genuine smile. Relief flooded their faces. You know what? I said, my voice perfectly even. You're absolutely right. I should be happy for you both. Mitchell actually smiled. A broad, relieved smile. I'm so glad you understand, Mare. This doesn't have to get ugly. We can still be a family. Not at all, I agreed cheerfully, reaching into my jacket pocket. In fact, since it's a day for new beginnings, I have a few things for you. I pulled out 3 thick, manila envelopes. The air in the room shifted. The relief on their faces curdled into confusion. I handed the first one to Mitchell. The second to my parents. And the last one to Brenda. "What's this?" my mother asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Just some paperwork," I said, grabbing my purse and keys from the counter. "Nothing urgent. You can look at it after I leave." "You're leaving?" Mitchell asked, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "Well, yeah. New beginnings and all that," I said, walking towards the door. "I should let you 2 lovebirds have your space." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Oh, and Brenda? You might want to move your car. I'm reporting it as stolen in about an hour." I walked out the front door and didn't look back. I could hear the sound of envelopes being ripped open behind me. I was 3 blocks away when my phone started to ring. It was Mitchell. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. By the time I reached the hotel I'd booked across town, I had 17 missed calls. The contents of those envelopes were the culmination of weeks of pain, planning, and legal counsel. They weren't just paperwork. They were the methodical demolition of the lives they had planned to build on the wreckage of mine. For my husband, Mitchell, the envelope contained the signed and notarized divorce papers. It also held a copy of the postnuptial agreement he'd carelessly signed 2 years prior when we refinanced the house, an agreement that clearly stated in the event of infidelity, he would forfeit any claim to the property and most of our shared assets. To top it off, there was a formal eviction notice, giving him 30 days to vacate the home that was solely in my name, and a stack of high-resolution, glossy photos of him and my sister, taken by my little unblinking eye. For my parents, Gerald and Lorraine, the envelope held copies of all the evidence, the videos, the texts, the credit card statements showing the extent of the affair they had knowingly concealed. It also included a formal letter from my lawyer withdrawing my financial support for their mortgage, a contribution I'd been making quietly for years. And finally, a notice that the family's cell phone plan, which I paid for, would be cancelled at the end of the billing cycle. And for my dear sister, Brenda. Her envelope was a special kind of surprise. It contained the legal documents showing that the car she was driving was, in fact, registered and titled in my name, since I had co-signed and she had never made enough payments to transfer it. The keys were now with my lawyer, and as I'd warned, the vehicle was now officially reported stolen. It also contained a formal, itemized demand for the repayment of every loan I had ever given her over the years, with interest, totaling just over $23,000. And the cherry on top, a notice that I had already provided her probation officer, from a little DUI charge I'd helped her with evidence that she had been violating the terms of her probation by cohabiting with a married man in his marital home while engaging in illicit activities. I sat in my quiet hotel room, turned my phone to silent, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The storm hadn't passed. The storm was just beginning. And for once, I was the one in the eye of it, calm and untouched. The chaos started less than an hour after I left. My phone, which I'd turned back on out of a grim sense of curiosity, became a non-stop barrage of desperation and rage. The voicemails were a symphony of their world falling apart. Mitchell's was first, a string of barely coherent sobs and pleas. "Meredith, please. You can't do this. Please come back, we can work this out. I'm begging you." Then came my mother's message, and her voice was shaking not with sorrow, but with pure, undiluted rage. "Meredith and Weiss, you get back here this instant. This is not how we raised you. Family doesn't destroy family." The hypocrisy was so staggering it was almost funny. Around midnight, hotel security called my room. "Ms. Weiss? There's a gentleman in the lobby, a Mr. Mitchell Weiss. He's claiming to be your husband and is demanding to see you." He's quite distressed. Through the phone, I could faintly hear him screaming my name. Please tell him I'm not available, I told the security guard, my voice calm. If he refuses to leave, please call the police. 20 minutes later, a text from Brenda buzzed on my phone. You need to come get your crazy husband. He's losing it and Mom is having a panic attack. This is all your fault. I read the text, a small, bitter smile on my face. My fault. Of course. I turned my phone off completely and went to sleep. I slept more soundly that night than I had in months. The next morning, the full picture of the meltdown came into focus through a flood of messages from other family members who were now being dragged into the drama. My cousin Sophie called. Mare, what on earth is going on? Your mom called me at dawn, hysterical. She said you were trying to ruin them. I learned that Mitchell had eventually gone to my parents' house, and all hell had broken loose. He and Brenda had a spectacular screaming match right there in the living room. According to Sophie's second-hand account, Brenda had shrieked at him, "This is all your fault. If you hadn't been in such a rush to tell her, we could have figured something else out." Their true love, their soulmate connection, had apparently evaporated the second real-world consequences showed up. Mitchell had stormed out, leaving Brenda sobbing on my parents' couch while they frantically tried to figure out how to handle the financial and legal atom bomb I had just dropped on them. They were finally learning that my role in the family wasn't just the reliable one, it was the one holding everything together. And I had just let go. In the days that followed, the initial satisfaction of my revenge began to curdle into something much darker. I had thought the worst part was the affair. Then I thought the worst part was my family's complicity. I was wrong on both counts. The worst part was discovering that what they had done wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a calculated conspiracy to steal my entire life. My lawyer, Diane, had suggested I hire a private investigator early on, a woman named Regina who specialized in infidelity cases but had a knack for digging into finances. Affairs are never just about sex, Meredith, Regina had told me during our first meeting. They're almost always about a whole web of deception. Financial, social, professional. Follow the money. She was right. Regina's investigation uncovered that Mitchell and Brenda hadn't just been having an affair, they had been actively planning a future using my resources. They had a shared savings account I never knew existed, funded by money Mitchell had been skimming from our joint account for months. They had been looking at apartments, discussing who would file for divorce first, even talking about how to let me down easy. But the most damning discovery was in the consultation notes Regina obtained from a lawyer they had met with. Not a divorce lawyer. A different kind of lawyer. They had been exploring whether they could claim common law rights to my house if they could prove they had been living together long enough. Their plan was to gaslight me, to make me believe I was imagining the affair, all while Brenda slowly established legal residency in my own home. They weren't just cheating on me. They were planning a hostile takeover of my life from the inside out. And then came the phone call that chilled me to my very soul. It was from my cousin, Perry, who worked in IT. I had sent him copies of the digital evidence, and he'd been digging through the cloud backup from our home security system, which included audio. Meredith, you need to sit down for this, he said, his voice grim. I found something in the photo backups. It's screenshots. Text conversations between Mitchell, Brenda, and your mom. What is it, Perry? I asked, a sense of dread washing over me. Mare, they were planning to have you committed. The words didn't make sense. Committed? What do you mean? There are texts from 6 weeks ago, he explained, his voice shaking with anger on my behalf. They were discussing how to handle your inevitable breakdown when they told you. Your mother was researching involuntary psychiatric holds. Mitchell was looking up symptoms of narcissistic rage. They were building a case that you were mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. He sent me the screenshots. Reading them felt like being stabbed, over and over. Mom, when we tell Meredith, she's going to lose it. She's always been unstable when things don't go her way. Mitchell, I've been documenting some of her controlling behaviors. We might need that for evidence. Brenda, she's been so suspicious lately. Almost paranoid. Maybe we can use that. Mom, Dr. Fontaine said that if we can show a pattern of irrational behavior, we could probably get a 72-hour hold for evaluation. I sat there in my sterile hotel room, staring at the words on my phone. My own family. My mother, my sister, my husband. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, to lock me away in a psychiatric facility, also they could take over everything I had ever worked for without a fight. The envelopes I'd handed them weren't just revenge anymore. They were self-defense. If I hadn't acted first, I wouldn't just be fighting for my assets in a divorce court. I might have been fighting for my very freedom from inside a padded room. The discovery of their plan to have me committed recontextualized everything that had happened in the months leading up to the party. It wasn't just random cruelty, it was a coordinated, psychological campaign. It was gaslighting on a scale I could never have imagined. Armed with this new, terrifying knowledge, I started making calls. My first was to an old friend from college, Janet. After the initial shock of the news, she said something that made my blood run cold. Meredith, this is going to sound crazy, she started, but your brother-in-law, Mitchell, he called me about a month ago. He what? Yeah, it was so weird. He said you'd been having some kind of breakdown and that the family was really worried about you. He asked if I had noticed any signs of instability, if you'd seemed paranoid or delusional in our texts. I felt sick. What did you tell him, Janet? I told him he was crazy. You're the most stable person I know. But Mare, what the heck is going on? Why would he be calling your friends asking about your mental health? That phone call opened a floodgate. Over the next few days, I discovered that Mitchell, Brenda, and my parents had been systematically contacting my friends, my colleagues, even acquaintances, laying the groundwork for their narrative. They were painting me as mentally unstable, gathering ammunition for their plan. My work colleague, Nina, called me. Meredith, I got the weirdest call from your sister. She was asking about your performance at work, whether you'd seemed stressed or erratic lately. I told her to call HR if she had concerns, but it felt really inappropriate. Even my former therapist, Dr. Hartman, whom I had seen for a few sessions years ago during a stressful period, called me. It was a breach of protocol, but she felt she had to. Meredith, I received a very concerning call from someone claiming to be your mother. She was asking about our sessions, whether I'd noted any signs of potential violence or instability. I told her I couldn't discuss your treatment, but she claimed you were having paranoid delusions about your husband cheating and that the family was worried you might hurt yourself or someone else. She wanted to know if I thought you met the criteria for involuntary commitment. My hands were shaking. They had already built the case. They had taken my discovery of their affair and twisted it into evidence of my paranoia. They had recorded my confrontations with them and planned to use them as proof of my instability. The final, horrifying piece fell into place when my lawyer, Diane, did some digging on Dr. Fontaine, the psychiatrist my mother had mentioned in her texts. We discovered they had already had a preliminary consultation. They had provided him with a comprehensive file, photos of the security camera I had installed, which they must have found, copies of notes I'd been making, and audio recordings of me confronting Mitchell. They had weaponized my search for the truth and turned it into a diagnosis. Meredith, Diane said, her voice grim over the phone, this is one of the most sophisticated and malicious gaslighting campaigns I have ever seen. They weren't just trying to get your assets in a divorce. They were trying to steal your reality. That afternoon, we filed for an emergency restraining order and sent cease and desist letters to Dr. Fontaine and anyone else my family had contacted. But in many ways, the damage was already done. I had learned that the people who were supposed to love me most were capable of a level of psychological warfare I never knew existed. They weren't just willing to betray me. They were willing to methodically and systematically destroy my reputation, my relationships, and my sanity to protect their secret. And the scariest part? They had come so close to succeeding. While I was reeling from the discovery of their psychological warfare, the more tangible consequences of my actions began to ripple outwards, hitting them from angles I hadn't even planned. The world, it seemed, had its own way of balancing the scales. The first domino was Mitchell. My lawyer, Diane, had sent a package to the HR department at his company. It contained a few key pieces of evidence, timestamps from my security footage showing him at my house with Brenda during business hours when he was supposed to be working from home, and credit card statements showing him using the company card to entertain Brenda at expensive restaurants under the guise of client meetings. 2 days later, he was quietly let go for gross misconduct and misuse of company resources. Without his handsome salary, his world started to shrink fast. Next was Brenda. The car I had reported stolen was impounded when she couldn't produce registration or insurance. Since the title was in my name, she was facing potential charges. Her probation officer was, to put it mildly, not amused to learn she'd been violating her terms. But her real downfall came from an unexpected source. The private investigator, Regina, had kept a casual eye on her. When the financial pressure mounted, Brenda got desperate. She started shoplifting. Small things at first, then bigger. Regina tipped off the local police. Brenda was arrested trying to walk out of a department store with a designer purse. Now she was facing multiple theft charges and a probation violation that would almost certainly mean jail time. Then there were my parents. The mortgage help I'd been providing was more significant than they had let on. Without it, they were staring down the barrel of foreclosure. But the financial strain was nothing compared to the social implosion. My uncle, my dad's older brother Warren, had been a quiet figure in my life, always kind but distant. When he heard the full story, something in him snapped. He was a man who valued integrity and loyalty above all else. He called me. "Meredith, I am so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. Your father called me, trying to spin some story about you being vindictive, but I heard the panic in his voice. I knew something was wrong." Uncle Warren went on a crusade. He called every aunt, uncle, and cousin. He laid out the facts, the affair, the complicity, and the horrifying plan to have me committed. The reaction from the extended family was swift and brutal. My parents were ostracized. The annual family reunion was cancelled. They had preached family first their entire lives, and now, they had no family left. The final piece of this messy puzzle was Uncle Warren's decision about the family business, a successful consulting firm he had built from the ground up. "Your father was supposed to take over when I retired," he told me during another call. "He was supposed to get the bulk of the inheritance. But after this, I can't, in good conscience, leave it to a man with no spine. I'm changing my will, Meredith. It's yours. You have the head for business and more importantly, you have the character." I was stunned. In the span of a few weeks, I had lost the family I was born into, but I was beginning to find the one that would choose me. The dominoes hadn't just fallen. They had shattered, clearing a path for a future I never could have imagined. Just when I thought the storm had finally run out of rain, one last, devastating thunderclap echoed through my life. My cousin Sophie, who had managed to stay somewhat neutral, called me, her voice trembling. "Meredith, there's something else," she stammered. "It's about Brenda. She's pregnant." The world tilted on its axis. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, all the air forced from my lungs. "Mitchell's?" The word was a dry croak. "That's the thing," Sophie said softly. "She says she doesn't know. The timing, it could be yours or his. For months, while I was planning our future, he had been sleeping with both of us. The thought that there might be a child involved, a child that could be mine, a permanent, living link to this nightmare, was almost too much to bear. Brenda, through Sophie, was asking to meet. She was claiming that if the baby was mine, she wanted to work things out. It felt like one last, desperate manipulation. I agreed to meet her, but on my terms. We met at a sterile, neutral coffee shop, with my lawyer Diane sitting at the next table. Brenda looked terrible. The confident, vibrant woman I knew was gone, replaced by someone exhausted and desperate. "Meredith, thank you for coming," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But if this baby is yours, don't you want to know?" "Of course I want to know," I said, my voice as cold and flat as I felt. "We will do a paternity test as soon as it's legally and safely possible. But I need you to understand something. Even if that child is mine, there is no us. There is no working things out. You don't get to burn my life to the ground and then ask me to help you roast marshmallows over the embers." The paternity test results came back 6 weeks later. I opened the email from Diane's office, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I read the conclusion, a single sentence that decided the rest of my life. The alleged father, Mitchell Weiss, is not excluded as the biological father of the fetus. He was the father. The baby wasn't mine. The relief was so immense, so total, that I broke down and sobbed for the first time since this whole ordeal began. They were tears of grief, yes, for the marriage I'd lost and the child I would never have. But mostly, they were tears of liberation. The final chain had been broken. I was free. I would not be tied to these people for the next 18 years, fighting over custody, visitation, and a college fund. My future was finally, completely, my own. What they had created together was their burden to bear, and their burden alone. That knowledge was the final, quiet, and most profound victory of all. If you are still listening to me, right here, right now, would you do me a kindness? Please help me by liking this video and leaving a comment with the number 1 down below. It lets me know that you gave me that like, and it tells me that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a bigger encouragement than you could ever know. It gives me the strength to keep going. Just comment the number 1 and then listen as I tell you the rest of my story. A few months after the paternity test, just as I was beginning to find my footing on solid ground, I got a call I never expected. It was my father. His voice was a weak, reedy whisper, a ghost of the booming voice I remembered from my childhood. "Meredith," he said, and I could hear the effort in each word. "I need to see you. I'm dying." The doctors had found pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. They'd given him 3 months, maybe less. "Please," he begged. "I know we destroyed everything. But I need to talk to you before it's too late." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I met him at the hospital. The man in the bed was a stranger. He had aged years in just a few months, frail and swallowed up by the sterile white sheets. My lawyer, Diane, sat quietly in a corner, a silent guardian. His eyes filled with tears the moment I walked in. "I need you to know," he whispered, his hand trembling as he reached for mine. "What we did to you, it was the worst thing I have ever done. Your mother, she convinced me. She convinced me you'd be better off without him, that Mitchell and Brenda were truly in love, that you'd eventually understand. I was weak. I was a coward. And I went along with it. It wasn't just about the affair, Dad," I said, my voice flat. "You were planning to have me committed." A sob escaped his lips. "I know," he choked out. "And I will regret that for whatever time I have left. Your mother, she got so caught up in this fantasy that she lost sight of what was right. And I was too afraid of her anger to stop her. We talked for 2 hours. He told me everything. About the pressure from my mother, the guilt he felt watching them manipulate me, the deep, gnawing knowledge that it was all wrong. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, his eyes pleading with me. "But I need you to know that I've always loved you. You were the daughter I was most proud of, and I failed you when you needed me most. I didn't forgive him that day. But I did agree to see him again. My father passed away 6 weeks later. I was there. I held his hand as he took his last breath. My mother was on the other side of the bed, her face a mask of stone. Brenda was in jail, unable to get permission to attend the funeral. At the service, the family was a fractured mosaic of grief and anger. Half the room wouldn't speak to my mother. I gave the eulogy. I spoke of the father I remembered from childhood, the man who taught me how to ride a bike and who worked double shifts to pay for my education. I didn't mention the man who had betrayed me. Afterwards, my mother approached me, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture defiant. "Meredith," she said, her voice brittle. "Now that your father is gone, can we please try to heal this family?" I looked at her, at the architect of my destruction, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hate. Just a vast, quiet emptiness. "Mom," I said softly. "There is no family to heal. You destroyed it." "But we're all we have left," she insisted, a frantic edge to her voice. "Brenda will be out of prison eventually, she'll need our help with the baby." "You made your choices, Mom," I said, cutting her off. "All of you. You chose them over me. You chose deception over honesty. You chose to try and destroy my sanity rather than admit what you'd done. Those choices have consequences." "But I'm your mother," she cried, the last desperate card she had to play. "No," I said, the word falling between us with a quiet finality. "A mother protects her children. A mother doesn't conspire to have them declared mentally ill. You stopped being my mother the day you decided Brenda's happiness was more important than my sanity." I turned and walked away from her that day. And I haven't spoken to her since. It's been a year now. A full year since that birthday party that felt like the end of the world. I'm writing this next chapter of my life from my new office in Seattle. Uncle Warren was true to his word. I took over the family business, and with my background in tech, we've transformed his consulting firm into a full-scale smart home automation company. We just landed a major contract, and for the first time in years, I feel genuinely excited about my work. About my future. I'm not alone here. I met someone. His name is Gregory. He's an architect, and he's kind and funny, and he loves me for who I am, not for what I can do for him. We moved in together last month. He's met Uncle Warren and Aunt Claire, who have become the parental figures I needed, the kind who value honesty and loyalty. I still talk to my cousin Sophie. She's the only one left from that old life. She tells me that my mother has had a complete mental breakdown, unable to cope with the consequences of her own schemes. Brenda is serving a 3-year sentence. And Mitchell is struggling, bouncing between jobs, a shadow of the man he used to be. I don't take any pleasure in their suffering. I just don't think about it anymore. That chapter is closed. But I want you all, everyone listening to this, to understand. This story isn't really about revenge. Yes, I made sure there were consequences. But the real story is about learning to value yourself enough to walk away from people who don't. For 35 years, I measured my worth by how much I could give to others. The affair was devastating, but the worst part was discovering that my own family saw me as a resource to be managed, not a person to be loved. Learning that was the most painful experience of my life. It was also the most liberating. It taught me that some relationships can't be repaired, not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about the people involved. It taught me that you have to choose yourself, even when it's the hardest thing in the world. You deserve to be surrounded by people who value you for who you are. You deserve relationships built on respect and honesty. Sometimes, you have to lose the family you were born into to find the family that was always meant for you. Sometimes you have to burn bridges to build better ones. And sometimes, the best revenge is just living well, truly and genuinely living well, without the people who never deserved you in the first place. Thank you all so much for listening, for being here with me. If my story resonated with you, please consider sharing it. You never know who might need to hear that it's okay to walk away. And please, subscribe for more stories. Your support means the world. Be well, and be good to yourselves.